Welcome to Chasing Green. We are live. We've got Dr. Frank. He is the president and chief scientist of Delta Waterfowl, and I'm just so thankful for you being here tonight, Dr. Frank. And I don't want to waste your time, so let's just jump right into it. Every year when the breeding population survey comes out, I notice there is a ton of misinformation about it, just a ton of confusion about it, really. Could you start off by just giving a brief explanation of what the survey is and how it's done?
All right. Basically, to manage ducks, we've always known we're going to need population estimates. You can't really manage any wildlife without knowing how many you got. And so in the late 40s and 50s, folks said, look, we know most of our ducks come out of the prairie pothole region and farther north in Canada, Arctic deltas. And so we ought to go and survey those regions. So and we had some really great pilot biologists early on. A guy named Frederick Lincoln, for instance, in the 30s, knew that, airplanes were the way to go. So we came up to Canada and figured out that, we can count ducks out of a light airplane. And we set up the surveys, and since the 50s, we've run these surveys every year. Largest wildlife survey in the world that's run annually. And it's the exact same set of transect lines. And generally what we do is we fly an airplane, and these guys weren't stupid. This is before the days of GPS. So they said, hey, let's take dirt roads and let's fly 150 miles down this dirt road, and we'll count ducks on both sides. The pilot will count ducks, and then you got an observer on the other side of the plane. And the observer counts both ducks and ponds. The pilot has to fly, so he better stick with just trying to count ducks. And they don't count them very far out. They count them in a narrow strip. And we've been doing this survey, and we time it generally for mallards. So we're trying to time it when mallards are right initiating nests. And that means it's a little bit early for things that are later nesters like gadwall. So we could be missing gadwall that haven't arrived yet, that they're still down in Louisiana or on their way north. But fly these survey lines. Now, it's no surprise when you're flying an airplane, you're going to miss some ducks. And you're going to miss ducks more commonly in a really wet year when the pond is oh, geez, let's see if I can do this. When the pond is here, but the water's out here. And so you got all this flooded vegetation. Well, a green-winged teal in flooded vegetation, guess what? You're not likely to see it from an airplane. And yet, if it's a dry year, and this is the outline of the pond, but the water is only in the middle, you got ducks sitting on mud, and so you can count them all. So we know we have to do a ground count to correct the air counts. So we take what's called a segment, a little 10-mile strip, and guys go and they drive a truck, take ATVs, they walk, but they count all the ducks, and then you get a correction factor. So correction factors can range from like 1.5 for canvasbacks. You see most canvasbacks. They're big, they're bright, they're white. Yeah. And it can go to 25 for green-winged teal. And so we count ducks, and basically that's the survey. And the survey lines, you can see them in the book. If we have real high densities of ducks, we put lots of survey lines. When you go to the boreal forest and you got 5 ducks per square mile, well, you spread the survey lines out. And then you have to extrapolate over a large area. But that's the count. It's a heck of an effort. It takes a ton of people. It takes Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologists. And of course, during COVID, we had a 2-year shutdown, which was really unfortunate. But so we've only missed 2 years of data since the 50s. So that's the survey.
One of the biggest one of the most common misconceptions I see about it is that it doesn't include the hatch, correct?
Oh, no. Nope. That's, in my view, the biggest problem with it. It is a snapshot of one period in usually, here in the Dakotas, it's early May. And things can change. Like this year, we all sat around this year in Bismarck, and we missed the record for the total amount of snowfall by a ½ inch. And of course, all of us are grumpy because we shoveled snow all winter long, and then we didn't break the record. But we all thought, man, it's going to be epic amounts of water. Well, we kind of forgot that last summer we got a spring snowstorm in May, and then it dried out, and we never got another bit of rain. Crops did lousy. So the soil was so dry that all that snow melted and soaked right in. It filled up the ponds initially, but it was so dry we had no runoff. So, we didn't have that much water in the spring, even though we thought we were going to have, a ton of water because of all the snow. But then in late May, we got rains. And so I think the snapshot missed it a little bit in terms of it hit after the snow melt, but before the rains. So in North Dakota, a lot of our ponds went up due to some great spring rains in late May. So it's a snapshot.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've heard from the people that I've, that are in the know on it, that we really had a better hatch and better conditions after the survey. It should be a better fall flight than what the numbers were showing.
Oh, I really think so. That even though the numbers are down a little bit this year, at least in the Dakotas where we had good water, we kept water. In fact, Chris Nikolai just came in. He's our biologist, and got a ton of experience. He came in and says, "My God, I was out scouting for doves, and there's water everywhere. There's temporary water. Like that doesn't happen in August in most years." So we've had good rains, and the other cool thing that happened. Okay, we when I say we, I'm generally talking about the duck community, and what I mean in this case was the Fish and Wildlife Service used to fly a brood survey. Well, the problem was in an airplane, you can't tell. I mean, you're flying at 120 miles an hour. A gadwall with ducklings and a mallard with ducklings, who knows? It's a brown duck with ducklings. So we gave up on it because we couldn't speciate it. We didn't have enough time to run ground crews. But here's something cool. North Dakota is the only place in the prairie pothole region, the duck producing area, where we run a brood survey. And it's a truck run survey. It's much like the North Dakota pair count, which generally parallels the big May survey. But this year, the brood count was off the charts. Mike Szymanski just released it, and really good brood production here in the Dakotas. Unfortunately, that's the only place in all of the prairies. No place in Prairie Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, or Alberta do we do any systematic survey.
Yeah. It kind of sounds like there can be some massive holes in the survey process. It's really, which, that's understandable. Like you said, it's one of the largest undertakings. It's hard to get something of that size perfect.
Yeah.
So, but with that said, I'm of the opinion that let's go by the science. I've not been one hollering for lower limits, but being a part of the duck community, that talk has definitely gotten louder over the past few years. And just in your opinion and in the circles you're running in, how prevalent is that with those who are making the decisions? Is it being talked about? Are we looking at restrictions if we get another bad year?
We could. Here's the interesting thing. We've pondered this question since the 50s, at least. What is the impact of harvest on ducks? And for decades and decades, it was real obvious. You shoot ducks, they're dead, they can't reproduce. But every deer hunter knows that deer reproduction and the health of your herd, if you get too many, it's not a good thing. Everybody that has local wildlife knows that. Well, somehow we think that can't apply to ducks because they migrate or something like that. And we finally started looking at it. And in 1975, a brilliant guy named, two guys, Burnham and Anderson, worked on this stuff and said, wait, we're doing this all wrong. And in fact, for ducks, harvest really isn't affecting the population size very much. And that was revolutionary. That was right when I started working at Delta Waterfowl as an assistant. And I was like, wow, that's remarkable. And since then, we've done, a ton of work. And the vast majority of the work says for ducks, it's all about duck populations are driven by the 3 months on the breeding grounds and not by winter survival, and certainly not by hunting, because we hunt at such restrictive levels. And by the way, the Europeans have always laughed at us and said, we shoot 40% of our ducks every year and our ducks aren't crashing. And you guys are fiddling around worrying about shooting between 6% and 15%. And they've just always laughed at us. So honestly, the evidence says duck harvest doesn't impact duck populations.
So for somebody who's never looked at the research or who have not looked at the studies, how do the studies say that? What evidence says that our harvests don't affect reproduction?
All right, there.
Because I know there's people asking that.
Yep. The kind of the most straightforward way is to basically plot, and we get this from largely from banding ducks. We can get annual survival rates, okay, and then we plot that versus harvest rates, kill rates, right? And we have to have a reasonable range of kill rates, but that was some of the original work. And basically, what you find is you can kill mallards, from the rate of 5% out to 20%, and see absolutely no change. In a year with 20% kill rates, we don't see any change in the annual survival rate. That's the simplest, sort of most straightforward way. Now, people have gotten frustrated with that and done far more complex stuff. And frankly, the math is so complex. That's one of our problems in waterfowl management. Now, in 1995, we did this strange thing in setting harvest regulations. And we used to argue this thing. We professionals would argue bitterly at flyway meetings. In the Mississippi Flyway, you're part of it, we had to have northern regs and southern regs committees. And the northern guys were always concerned about shooting too many ducks because it's their breeding ducks. And the southern guys were always wanting to shoot more. And then they'd come together and have a terrible day meeting, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was trying to mediate, and it was a mess. So we tried a new system where we said, we're going to take, it's called AHM, Adaptive Harvest Management. And what it was we're going to use a bunch of different mathematical models that simulate duck population biology. And we're going to take the extremes. We're going to say hunting, every duck you shoot means one less than the breeding population, completely additive mortality. And the other one is something we call compensatory, that you shoot a duck in the fall, right? And it's a hen mallard. She can't lay eggs, right? She's dead as hell. But it may be that by reducing the population, some magic happens. There's density dependence, and total annual survival doesn't change because all the rest of the ducks do somehow better. Okay, that's compensatory. So we built these alternative models. Now, this is where it gets weird, because those models will actually say we should regulate the duck harvest. And so the reigning models, they were in existence last year. And when I saw the duck numbers, I sort of freaked out, because the reigning models only used to use Canadian ponds, just because we started counting ponds in the US a little later. So they used Canadian ponds and total mallard numbers. And well, Canada's been in the doldrums. It's been dry as heck in Saskatchewan and Alberta. We have half the ponds right now than we had in the peak. When we had ducks everywhere in 2013, we had a lot of water on the landscape. We now have way less water. So no surprise, Canadian ponds are half of what they were. And based on last year's models, which basically look at pond numbers and duck numbers, we would be in a restrictive regulation next year. But fortunately, the models were just changed, and we included U.S. ponds. And the U.S. in recent years has just been consistently much wetter than Saskatchewan and Alberta. And so fortunately, that means next year we're still squarely in a liberal 6 and 60 package. And I understand a lot of guys.
Based off this year's survey, you already know that it'll be liberal next year.
Yes, right.
Okay.
Right.
And so if next year is a more of a downtrend year, they'll run it through the models again, and then
every year we do the same thing. Now, we used to set regulations based on the current year's data. So we would set this fall's regulations based on this May count. It just got to be so difficult to run the surveys, accumulate the data. And, most federal processes, you're supposed to give the public 90 days to comment. Well, we'd always shorten that to 30 days. And even then, we never made it. we were telling people what the duck season would be like 6 days before the duck season opened in Alaska.
Yeah.
And so they just said, this is crazy. And partly that's no big deal, because remember, we've had 40, 50 years of science showing harvest really doesn't affect ducks. So we don't have to freak out every year and try and set regulations. So,
or at least harvest in the way that we harvest them. Obviously,
right. Yes.
Harvest could affect them if, as market days or something like that.
Oh,
but
yeah.
at a 6 duck per person, it's
right.
It's not enough.
If we started to allow, 120-day seasons and 8-bird, 10-bird limits, probably we could reduce some ducks. But
yeah,
the rate we hunt, ducks are pretty adaptable and
so
find the places that are safe, as you probably know.
Yes, very much so. So let me just kind of recap what you're saying. You're saying one reason why we've been in a liberal framework for so long is not only have we had great duck populations, especially like through 2015 and everything, but also more recent research has said harvests really don't make as big of a difference as we thought. So we've leaned towards more liberal than we would have, 30, 40 years ago.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Like this year's mallard numbers are actually pretty close to what they were in the early 90s. And we were just coming out of 3 and 30 and slowly moving into more liberal regulations. But, I think we've learned an awful lot. Now, I should say that AHM models would still, constrain us when we hit a real drought and mallards really drop. And most of us say, yeah, okay, we can live with that. I lived through 3 and 30 in the 80s. I obviously like 6 ducks better than 3, but we all want to conserve ducks. So. Speaking
of that, how you were talking about how dry it has been, how big of a drought we've been in. How bad is this drought that we're currently in compared to the last bad one we had that set off the point system and everything?
Yeah, it's not that bad, because the drought of the late 80s was pretty much everywhere. I mean, I drove by places in North Dakota that used to be huge lakes, and they were farming the bottom of them. And now, we've had so much water that those are 50 square mile lakes, and they were farming the bottom of them in the 80s.
Wow.
So what we would have to have is a series of dry years where it's dry everywhere. And then that would drive mallards down. Now, mallards being the most abundant duck, you get to be the most abundant duck because you breed everywhere. Well, that means mallards were down quite a bit this year. Like, I think they were down about 18% from last year. Well, we shouldn't be totally surprised. Saskatchewan and Alberta have been dry as heck for years, and they have half the ponds they used to have. Yeah, the Dakotas are still doing okay, but mallards are down, more than other ducks. Teal took a big jump down, but they're still above the long-term average. So teal are doing pretty well. Well, mallards are quite a bit below their long-term average. So if we got 3 dry years in a row over the entire prairies, I'd be worried about restrictive seasons.
Yeah. So this kind of drought trend that we've been in, even though it's not as bad as we've seen in the past, how much of a role has that played on loss of wetlands, like farmers being able to get in there and farm them where they couldn't in the past?
Yeah. Honestly, we don't worry too much about when a wetland goes dry and it gets farmed. I have seen hundreds and hundreds of ponds in a dry year. A couple of years ago, the Dakotas were just like, oh man, it was bad. We produced virtually no corn. It all got written off. And most seasonals and temporary ponds started dry and stayed dry, and guys farmed right through them. And that's even when we have, that's perfectly legal, even when we, you and I have been buying duck stamps for a long time, me for obviously a hell of a lot longer. And we've bought a lot of easements where the pond has to exist. The farmer cannot drain the pond. But if it's dry, he can farm right through it, and it honestly doesn't hurt it. So farming through a pond that's dry, that's not a problem. Here's the problem. When it's dry, it's easy for a farmer to go in there with a little tiny scraper and take that small wetland, and those small ones are really valuable, and drain it with a ditch and put it into a big pond. And that's what we call consolidation drainage. And that's our biggest problem right now. We occasionally have whole water districts that cut a huge ditch and they can drain everything. Most prairie wetlands can be drained, but the most common drainage is to take the small ones and drain them into the big one. Because if you're pulling an 85-foot, air seeder, you do not want to go around a little 30-foot pond. But those 30-foot ponds are valuable. So that's what I worry about, and we've seen a fair amount of that in recent.
Is it realistic that we can make a difference in that, like DU Delta putting wetlands back, or is it this is going to be a losing battle?
Well, there are two things in a sense, you just mentioned. Putting wetlands back, that's an uphill battle, because once a guy is drained and is farming the thing, he's not real excited about plugging up the ditch and having to go around it and spending diesel fuel and losing acreage. Keeping them from draining, that's a whole different thing. And frankly, we've done a darn good job of it south of the 49th. In the U.S., just take the North Dakota and South Dakota. That's where most of the ducks are coming out of in the U.S. So I would drain their wetlands before we even had a chance to save them. But we've protected a third of the wetlands with easements and a little bit of fee title purchase, WPAs that you see on the landscape if you're up here in North Dakota. But that means 2/3 of the wetlands are not protected except by this thing called Swamp Buster. And what we did, and we've done this since the 1930s, we say we love motherhood, apple pie, and family farming, right? And so we're going to give farmers subsidies to stay in business. And it's a major subsidy we give to farmers. And so it's real hard to farm here in the prairies anywhere without the government subsidy. So
yeah, I was about to say it's hard to farm anywhere now.
Yeah, that's right. Commodity prices are good, but diesel and input prices are wicked bad. So that's how we protect our wetlands in the Dakotas with this Swamp Buster thing. If you drain your wetlands, then you lose your crop insurance, and that's a big deal. And so, we've had hail all over the state. I was just looking at pictures from a guy who had a sunflower field. You'd never know it's sunflowers. It looks like stalks of cane every 2 feet. It's just a brittle, it's destroyed. So
I've had a lot of people asking me about the pintails.
Yeah.
Where are we at with those? And could you give a brief description of why they're facing such an uphill battle as well?
Yeah, it'll take me a minute. But okay, remember we had some people go way back. When we started the surveys, we thought we counted 10 million. Nobody believes that happened. There were a couple of years where we counted 10 million pintails, and everybody believes something went funky with the survey for a couple of years. All right. But we know in the old days, in the 70s, we regularly had 6 million pintails with this May survey, right?
Yeah.
And then the drought of the 80s comes along, and it's dry everywhere for a bunch of years. And pintails, mallards, they all reach record lows, right? And then it gets wet again in the early 90s, and it got really wet. And here's the problem. We didn't notice that there was an ag revolution in prairie Canada. Not so much here in the Dakotas, a little bit, but what happened in prairie Canada, and remember it was dry, and the limitation to wheat production and barley is too dry to produce much. So the University of Manitoba agronomists said, hey, you guys that are trying to get your field really ready so you can plant in the spring because, it's a short summer, it's a mistake. Leave the stubble on the landscape. So you cut wheat, you got stubble that stands about that high, right? Sometimes it stands up a foot, but often it's only 6-8 inches. Well, here's the bad news. All of a sudden it gets wet, but there's been this ag revolution. And in the old days, pintails would return and see brown fields, right? And so they'd find the grass. Now they return to the prairies and they see this huge expanse of shortgrass prairie, because pintails are a western duck that used to nest in their highest density in western Saskatchewan and the prairies of Alberta and Saskatchewan, where it's dry, short grass. So they viewed that stubble as, hey, that's nesting cover. No mallard. I've never seen a mallard nest in stubble. They just said, that's terrible grass. I wouldn't nest there. I'm going to go find some tall grass. Well, pintails nest in the stuff. And unfortunately, they have real poor nest success in it. And guess what they do if they lose their nest? They re-nest and they go right back into the stubble. And if they're lucky enough to survive the predators, John Deere is 100% efficient as a predator. And so when the farmer ends up seeding right into the stubble, he scrambles the eggs that the predators didn't get. So, so pintails have seen this phenomenal shift. That's my explanation. Now, there's another part to the pintail problem. It seems counterintuitive, but with that long neck, you'd think they might like deep water. Not a chance. They love shallow wetlands, really ephemeral. They're the only dabbling duck that's completely non-territorial because those wetlands often dry up so fast. They just come in, female, uses that pond, nest nearby, and they don't even defend the territory. So they love shallow water. Well, we just talked about pond drainage, and the ponds that are getting drained the most, shallow ephemeral ponds. So they're facing the double whammy. I don't think we'll ever get back to 6 million pintails. We'll hover around, this business of 1.75, 1.8 million to 3 million. If Saskatchewan and Alberta have wicked wet years, a couple of them in a row, the pintails will jump up to 3 million. But they still have this problem of nesting in stubble. And
I've heard through various sources that they have a bad gender problem, as in there's a bigger male to female ratio in them. Is that true? And if so, is there any chance of upping the Drake limit?
That is true. We're seeing this terrible trend in a variety of species. So mallards are the same deal. Mallards are approaching a sex ratio now of 3-to-1, and that's just not good. Pintails are at the same rate, and so now with mallards, it's going to be hard for us to differentially harvest more males than we already harvest. We already shoot a lot more males than females.
Hey, I'm down for that.
Yeah,
give me more greenheads on the limit.
That's right.
I'll vote for that any day.
And so, AHM regulations are pretty restringent. I personally think that once we revise the models and get better predictive models, we could easily have a 6 mallard limit. I'm happy with keeping the hens at 1 or 2, but there's no reason not to shoot 6 Drake mallards, and down in the South, we do a much better job than up here in the North because we're shooting brown ducks half the season. It's hard to tell.
Sure.
I think we ought to do the same thing with pintails. Now, here's the downside. So far, the evidence is our harvest rates are so low, it won't help. But I'm ready to try it.
It wouldn't even make a difference.
Let's have a 4 pintail limit. Keep the hens at 1. Go to town, boys, and shoot 4 drakes. And I think everybody after November 15th could tell Drake pintails. Probably November 1 could tell the drakes and would differentially select. We know that happens in mallards, but that's my view. There are a lot of state biologists that are nervous about that. There are a lot of people that think complicated regulations turn hunters off. I don't think that's the case. I think you could do a quick survey and ask hunters, hey, would you rather have 4 pintails and still have the 1 hen restriction or just have it be 1 pintail? And
yeah, I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense because we've done it with mallards for years. Right. I mean, I mean, why would it be that much? And it's easier to tell on a pintail, really. I mean, well, they're both easy to tell, but
they're both pretty easy to tell. I think it'd be tough on gadwall, for instance.
Sure.
There are a lot of hunters that aren't good enough to, I've been doing duck biology for 50 years. And when gadwall come in, I can generally pick the drakes out. But sometimes it's not easy and you get bad light and fog,
On the sex ratio, what's causing this change? Do we know?
It's pretty clear that it is declining female survival, and it's because of this problem on the prairies that things are getting tougher for ducks up here. Less and less cover, predator problems. Pintails are getting hammered on the nest, and it's all females that are dying. The differential between males and females is ridiculous. We have the best data for mallards, but 23% of hen mallards die in the parklands every spring. They get killed on the nests or with the ducklings. It's less than 1% for males. So there's a huge differential on the breeding grounds. And by the way, this whole additive and compensatory, we're talking ducks. Geese are a different story, and we can overharvest geese, although geese are doing great, but we have goose populations we need to be careful with. So for sure. Yeah.
Well, with pintails like they are and mallards kind of trending in that direction, what's the answer for it? Just predator control or getting more habitat back, or a realistic answer that we could actually achieve?
A realistic answer is, first, just be aware that we're going to live for a while with reduced numbers of pintails. And we've tried restrictive regulations for 20 years. It hasn't helped a bit. So we really need to look at pintail numbers. We're shooting one pintail when they're at 2.5 million. We got 700,000 canvasbacks and we're shooting 2 per day. Come on. Sometimes these AHM models make me a little crazy because they just aren't practical. I'm impressed that guys can do that fancy math, but if the models are wrong, I don't really care about the fancy math. So,
sure.
I think with pintails, there are a couple of solutions. Predator control obviously works, and when we trap predators, we get big increases in production of pintails. Having a ton of grass on the landscape helps. So in the CRP years, the Dakotas produced a lot of pintails, and everyone was quite surprised at that. Well, we've lost half of our CRP here, and that CRP, sorry, that's an acronym, Conservation Reserve Program Grass. When commodity prices were really low, the government said, hey, we'll pay you to plant grass. That'll reduce the amount of commodities. Price of wheat will go up. Well, now we have so much demand that farmers don't need it, and the government stopped paying for it.
Sure.
So we've lost a lot of CRP. Having big grass programs in Canada. The biggest bump for pintails probably happened when the Canadian government said, we're going to quit subsidizing wheat transport. Canada's a different country. 80% of their grain gets exported. We export 20% of our grain and use 80% of it. So Canada lives on grain exports. And to export grain from Saskatchewan, you got to transport it over the mountains. And the federal government used to pay what's called the crow rate, Crow's Nest Pass. And they said, forget it. We're not paying that anymore. Well, all of a sudden, the balance between being a cattle rancher and having grass versus growing wheat, it shifted, and a lot of land went back into cattle and grass. And pintails like grass, cattle and ducks. That's a real good mix. Cattle like water. Nobody drains wetlands. Ducks love grass. So if we could get subsidies for ranching like we have for farming, it'd be great. But that doesn't seem to be on the political landscape. None of the Republican dudes last night were talking about any subsidies for ranchers.
No, they were not.
Mind you, that's a little deep in the weeds. But
yeah. One person asked, have you seen species, you're talking about such a change on the landscape, are species adapting to that, or will they just keep trying the same thing over and over and just fail?
So far, we've seen no change in pintails. Now, mind you, we did a bunch of studies. We at Delta did a bunch of studies and looked at differential use of really nice pieces of grass. Ducks Unlimited Canada plants, quarter sections of grass here and there. And unfortunately, pintails were no more likely to use that gorgeous planted nesting cover than an adjacent quarter section of wheat stubble. Now, we haven't done those studies recently, but we ought to redo them, because maybe you would think pintails would eventually, the pintails that are successful are the ones that nest where there's better cover and they have higher nest success. So the only change that I can say I've seen is, wow, we got to go back in history, but in the late 70s, I started my graduate work. Yeah, I'm old, and I was working in the parklands near a town called Mendoza. Some of the best breeding habitat in prairie Canada, really high densities of wetlands, and yet the parklands have always been known, because it has real stable water and a bunch of trees mixed in with ag land. It also has a lot of predators, and nest success is traditionally terrible. And so in my days, nest success was 5%. That's just brutal. Ducks can't make it on 5% nest success. But, there were mallards and teal trying. And we had a bunch of Delta students working there. And mallards were trying the same old thing, nesting in the grass, sometimes going into trees, trying different stuff. And nowadays, the majority of mallard nests that we find in that same landscape, same study blocks I was on, decades ago, an awful lot of the mallards have shifted to doing what canvasbacks and redheads do. They go into the cattail cover and build a nest over water, and they have much higher success rates. Now,
wow.
The success rates average around 20%, but 20% is 4 times better than 5%. So we've seen a lot of mallards make this transition to nesting over water. And mallards, let's face it, mallards are so successful because they're adaptable. They do all sorts of things. We put out these nesting structures, hen houses. Mallards love them. Basically, no other ducks use them. Wood ducks use them for sure. We've tried them on mottle ducks down south, black ducks on the East Coast, and those ducks are conservative, never do anything different. Mallards try different things all the time. And so mallards have made a shift in my lifetime of largely nesting over water, and
wow.
It's a good shift for them. So, yeah.
That's crazy. I've seen a lot on those hen houses, and just the research you guys have done on them, and it seems to be a good thing moving forward to try to get more of those.
Oh, yeah. They're super valuable, particularly in the parklands, because you got much more permanent water and you got this terrible background nest success. And so when you put them up in the parklands, mallards jump in them and do really well. So, we typically get 60 to 80% nest success in these hen houses. So,
sure.
It's one of the ways to raise ducks.
Yeah, I would like to briefly touch on, I had a question from earlier when we were talking about harvest rates, and just we shoot for, you said 6 to 15%. What's the death rate from predators on the total duck population each year? Do we know? Do we have an estimate on that?
We don't. Okay. We have pretty good estimates during some parts of the year. So on the breeding grounds, we've done a lot of work on where we put transmitters on ducks and track them. And the vast majority of the female mortality during the breeding season is predation. And it's predation when they're sitting on the eggs. Mm-hmm. Now, they're also fairly vulnerable when they're with ducklings, but that predation rate appears to be quite a lot lower than when they're sitting on the nest. And it very much depends on the predator community. Red fox are by far the worst predator because they're really efficient at capturing females on the nest. And skunks bumble around and rarely capture females, but they're probably just as hard on eggs as foxes are. The rest of the year, it's a mystery.
Sure.
We know annual survival rates are, for most ducks in the range of 55 to 60, and it's remarkably consistent. And yet we can't tell you. We can't find those mallards. Now, we can put a bunch of transmitters on, but then we're messing around changing the actual probability that a duck survives. We've gone crazy in recent years. Basically, technology created this cocaine for duck biologists. We got these GPS accurate transmitters that could tell you a duck was here or 3 feet over there. Holy Christmas. And then the transmitter collects this data and transmits it by the cell phone, GSM, so you don't even have to leave your office. You put the transmitter on and wow, you got this fabulous. And then you add solar recharge. We went crazy and we started putting backpacks on ducks everywhere. And it turns out it looks like the backpack has a very detrimental effect on the duck.
So you're saying, I've not heard this before. So you're saying that the backpacks cause a higher rate of mortality in the duck.
Okay, I'm going to get myself in trouble with my peers, but hell yes. Hell yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
I've not heard that.
On the breeding grounds, we quit putting backpacks on ducks, 30 years ago? We know perfectly well that if you put a backpack on a mallard, it'll lay one set of eggs and then it quits. And normally they will re-nest multiple times. I put them on blue-winged teal, and I messed up totally. So my dissertation was based on backpacks, and it's all wrong. Wow. It took us a while to learn it. The crazy thing is, Jake, the best way to put a transmitter on a duck is not to put it on the duck, but to put it inside the duck. Seems insane. Hire a vet, cut the duck open, put the transmitter in. It seems brutally intrusive, but in a few days, the duck does really well. Diving ducks, every time we put a transmitter on the outside, they're dead. Put them internally, and they live for years. It's crazy.
That's crazy. Yeah, there needs to be more talk of that. I just, no one talks about that because, like you said, everybody's doing it right now, and it's just I never even thought that it would change their behavior really in any way, much less cause more death in them.
Yeah.
So
I'm pretty convinced it does. Now, remember, I'm one of the rare people that is going to say that. We actually have a study going on at Delta right now. We just put a whole bunch of transmitters of different types on, and we're looking at the differential survival and migration and a variety of things. So we'll have a better answer soon. But from the breeding grounds, it doesn't surprise me at all. Like nobody on the breeding grounds would put a backpack on a duck and expect it to behave right. And so,
going back to earlier, you talked about how the Dakotas come out with the brood report that just came out recently and said that, we had a great hatch. What have you heard about, the prairies of Canada and just as a whole, what do we think that the hatch was?
Now you're going to rely on what I call fairly anecdotal stuff. So I took a trip through Saskatchewan not too long ago, about 2,000 miles, went up to some of our research sites, drove around a lot. And I'll be honest, I was surprised. Now, first I drove through southern Saskatchewan, places I've hunted before, bone dry, Well, it started dry, it stayed dry, and not producing any ducks. But I did get into some areas of Saskatchewan that I was impressed with. There are a couple of sort of big, really great habitat blocks, the Dana Hills, the Allen Hills in Saskatchewan. Talk to any DU guy and he'll say, oh yeah, we got a lot of activity going on in the Dana Hills. Right. Where you tend to try and protect habitat is where it's the very best.
Yeah.
And I was pleasantly surprised with the Dana Hills. There were a lot of broods. It was rather shocking. We have a bunch of study sites up there, 25 square mile study blocks, and 6 of them. And so, they're spread out over, 1,000 square miles. And I was pleasantly surprised. And it was a weird thing. I've never seen teal broods outnumber other species so dramatically. So teal broods were like 10-1 compared to mallards. And normally teal and mallards are neck and neck, the most abundant ducks. And then you have gadwall and you have shovelers. But gadwall and mallard broods were scarce and teal broods were everywhere. And I think that's just a function of, it was a real low nest success. Teal do better in those situations. They stick tighter than mallards. They take risks. They have higher nest success. And then because of a bunch of summer rains in that spot as well, the teal renested late. So in late July, I was seeing teal broods fully grown. and downy duckling. Hell, we were marking birds with transmitters, hadn't even hatched. So those teal aren't going to be on the wing by the time teal season open. September 1, we have openers soon. I guarantee the females are going to be flightless in molt if they're not taking care of ducklings. So it was a strange year late, but that's good for production.
Yeah.
Actually, those teal will make it to Louisiana.
So looking at the breeding grounds as a whole this year, even with the late rains included, would you say that we were still well under water-wise than what we need?
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah,
because you hear different people on the internet, we had the water this year, but we still don't have the ducks. So we really didn't have that much water.
We didn't have that much water. We had water. It was spotty. And unfortunately, the prairies almost always outproduce the parklands. Parklands typically have more water. So I was talking about some parkland habitat a minute ago, but the prairie habitat in southern Saskatchewan, man, it's tough. It's just been dry for years, and we need a wicked winter and a lot of rain.
It's really going to take getting that Alberta and Saskatchewan back to really bump it up.
Absolutely, yeah. If we want to have duck levels like we saw, 2011, 2013, just ducks everywhere, record high ducks.
Sure.
A lot of people thought, how can we have record high ducks? Well, water washes away a lot of sins. We'd had a lot of drainage of ponds in Prairie Canada, but when you get that much rain and snow, good things happen.
Yeah, that was really surprising to me when I first started researching this a few years ago. I didn't realize that 2000, whatever that was, 14, 15, somewhere in there, it may have been 13, that was the highest, mallard numbers ever recorded. A lot of people don't think or realize that.
Yeah.
They talk about the golden years, but so it really is as simple as, if we get the water, we're going to get the ducks back. We've got the habitat there. We just need it to get wet again.
There are two things that drive duck production. You got to have water. Ducks have to settle and have water, and then you have to have nest success. And so, we focus on water because that's the only thing we measure. Nobody dreams of a predator index and looking at duck production. So
sure,
might be feasible in the future because, we've done a bunch of work recently with drones and found out that we can really count broods pretty accurately. And that's a cool breakthrough for research. But whether we could make that operational over this, we're talking about an area bigger than Texas. You're going to count all the ducks in Texas? Yeah, good luck.
Yeah.
So it'd be tough to do a production survey.
Sure. So other than the hen houses that Delta's doing and the CRP work that's putting grass back, is there really any other programs or organizations doing anything to add to duck production actively?
Okay, here's what Delta's take is. And of course, Delta focuses on protecting habitat and increasing duck production. And we've done 40, 50 years of work on duck production. And unfortunately, we found a lot of techniques that really don't work very well. The two that work, lethal predator management. We know we can trap predators and really bump up duck production. And that's the cheapest way to make increased duck production. Now, hen houses is not much more expensive. And of course, hen houses produces ducks that most hunters want. Most hunters love mallards. Let's face it. Yeah. And so those are the two things we've found that are efficient and effective. Unfortunately, first of all, let's face it, predator management is not politically correct in some circles. And so, a lot of groups and organizations have shied away from it. What appears like it would work is spreading out nests so they're a needle in a haystack. And that means, buying chunks of land here and there and planting grass and hoping that you really improve nest success. And here's the weird thing. We've done that experiment, good Lord, a lot of times, and it really doesn't work. When you plant a quarter section of grass, basically you've made great home for two families of red fox and a bunch of skunks. Yeah.
It's kind of like doing a food plot for ducks. You plant, they're going to come. If you plant a nesting site, predators are going to come.
Right. And so if you plant a ton of grass, you change the scale, and I think what happens, and honestly, this is not proven by science because we haven't done it the science well enough. But I think when you plant a ton of grass, you get a shift in the predator community. And frankly, we know that coyotes are way better to have on the landscape than fox. Fox always cache eggs. Think of a fox as a gray squirrel. Every time it finds a nest, it takes every egg and moves them a little ways and hides them. Winter food, okay? And fox are also really good at capturing females on the nest. And coyotes, by and large, think ducks are not worth messing with. You know, coyotes would rather eat jackrabbits. And so, you know, coyotes are our friend. Foxes are our enemy. So big chunks of grass promote coyotes. Badgers are badass predators, but they also take care of skunks and raccoons and lower the skunk and raccoon population. And our trifecta of the worst predators: fox, coons, skunks. And so if we can change the predator community by planting vast amounts of grass, let me just warn you, a lot of that was pretty speculative. We've not done those experiments well, but I'm convinced that's the case. So,
Gotcha. Yep. Well, I mean, you've been around it a long time, so I would say your opinion matters on the subject. One thing I wanted to ask you is, since I've started kind of studying going to Canada and hunting there, I've noticed that their recent modern rule update that they did is a lot better than what we got going on here. Is there any chance that we will ever update like the possession limits and stuff like they did? Is there any talk of that whatsoever?
Yeah, I love that. I love that possession limit and the business that once it's processed, you know, it doesn't count. You're always worried about, yikes, I got more than a possession limit in my freezer. What happened if the feds show up?
Well, I try to avoid that, but but it is annoying. I mean, you get 18 ducks. I mean, my wife and I can eat 18 ducks in 9 meals. I mean, that's not going to last you a year. That's not even a meal a month. I mean, that's not enough. Is there any talk to go back and revisit these rules and update them?
It's pretty controversial, and there's not much movement in the U.S. It'd be nice, but
why is it controversial?
You know, there's just this long-standing view that harvest really makes a difference to duck populations, and yet, I just told you we've had 40 years of information that says that's not the case.
So some people think that keeping that possession cap on it is keeping ducks from being shot.
Yeah, some people
that's
think
the argument.
So
there's basically a controversy in the Fish and Wildlife Service, is what you're saying.
It's not just the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's also state agencies. I've seen, you know, I'm getting out on a limb here, but it seems to me like there's more and more separation of enforcement folks from biologists. In many states, biologists used to have enforcement authority, and there are relatively few states where that happens now. And so you have these two different camps, and it's a little unfortunate, in my opinion, that the enforcement side of many state agencies and even some of the feds have this, and certainly not everyone, but they have this attitude that, you know, hunters are lawbreakers and I just haven't caught you yet. And that attitude drives me crazy. We are losing hunters. We're trying to recruit hunters and save, you know, this lifestyle that, hell, it matters a huge amount to you and me. I'd hate to see my grandkids not have the opportunity, or it's politically unacceptable. And yet, you know, we often have enforcement folks that just, you know, make you feel like you're a criminal the minute they see you, you know, and so. And part of this business is those sorts of regulatory changes come from the enforcement side, and they don't want to make them for some reason, and it's unfortunate. I think if biologists had a greater say in those sorts of regulations, we might see the sort of positive change that we've seen in Canada. You know, I love those. bag limit changes and the fact that you can have 3 days of limits. So, yeah.
Yeah, Canada's got it figured out. Once you freeze it there, it goes, it
Yeah.
leaves your possession limit, which I
Right.
just don't think there's that many people taking advantage of that. I mean, it's just so much gray here in the United States too. What about, I've heard different feds say different things. Like, what if you turn it into sausage? Well, is it
Yeah.
still possession or not?
Right.
You know,
Right.
like it's like, and I've heard some people say yes and some people say no on that, people that
Yeah.
matter. So, you
Yeah.
know, it's just a lot of gray. I wish we could kind of clarify that and just make it more specific about what
Exactly.
possession is. But it sounds like my dream's not going to come true on that.
I wouldn't hold your breath. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just put it that way.
Gotcha. You kind of touched on something there that's really been kind of a big deal to me, and that's how fast we're losing hunters and just
Yeah.
how bad it's gotten. People don't realize it, but I mean,
Yeah.
we've lost half since like the 70s.
Yeah.
And one thing I see right now, I hunt 95% public land. I hunt probably 70, 80 days a year. And there's this alarming trend right now of a lot of states, including my home state, of starting to include more restriction and limiting more access on non-residents.
Yep.
I mean, it's a bad trend in my opinion, and it's unneeded in a lot of places, and that may be unpopular, but what is Delta's thoughts on what's going on? Like Kansas right now is trying to restrict non-res.
Yeah.
Is there talk among you guys on that? Or
that's a really tough issue because we don't want to restrict hunters, but the flip side is there's been so many hunters that have left hunting, and most of them say, well, it's an access issue. I used to be able to hunt public land and I could go out there and have a reasonable hunt, and now there are 27 hunters in my spot, and the private land I used to hunt on has all been leased, and I can't afford to lease. So it's a terrible issue, in my opinion. And frankly, there's no right and wrong. And we don't have an official position. We would, we love the old days when you could go out and ask permission and get on land without having to spend a fortune. And frankly, those days are, even here in North Dakota, we're seeing lots of leasing happening. And 15 years ago, that was almost unheard of. When I moved to Louisiana, I'd been hunting as a student in Kansas, and you could get on land. And so I said, well, I'm going to go ask permission. And people looked at me like I had corns growing out of my head. Every square inch of Louisiana has been leased for decades,
Yeah.
And so, I was like you. I hunted public land. And unfortunately, we're seeing public land not managed as well because of lack of funding. And so the number of ducks we see on public land these days is declining. And meanwhile, private guys are figuring out how to manage better and better and holding more ducks. So,
and just to be clear on what I was saying, I do think states should, have rights. I think that they should protect their guys. I just think some are going too far. It's swinging too far. Because, I mean, as well as I do, I mean, there's 30,000 duck hunters in Georgia. There's 15,000 in Alabama. I mean, them guys have got to travel if they want to go shoot a mallard pretty much. And it's just, I try to view it from their lens that, they're not from a place like Arkansas like I am. And I hate to see all these East Coast guys constantly getting limited and new people coming into the sport. Basically, every state saying, we don't want you here.
Yeah.
Like, the residents are saying that, and even the state agencies and sometimes are saying that. And it's just a bad time for a new guy to come in. They're just constantly facing more access limitation and more restrictions.
Yeah.
And I just, like, you guys are doing a 1 million duck campaign, and I think that's awesome. But if we could do some kind of add 1 million acres of public campaign, that's much needed right now. Right. And there's basically no push from any state agency to add more public land. It's like almost this defeated mentality of we got what we got and this is it.
Yeah. Yeah. You look at state agencies and they're hurting and, they're broken and they can barely manage the land, in a lot of places I've looked at barely manage the land they have. And so it is tough.
Is that the biggest challenge you think, that they, even if they got more land, they just wouldn't be able to manage it or do anything with it?
Boy, I worry about that because I've seen, so many places where, God, they have a great dike area and they can't afford to pump. Their diesel pump got flooded or burnt out, and they can't afford a new pump. And so, you got great potential to manage well and have moist soil management or flooded timber, and no, it can't move water. Or worse yet, we got a pump, can't afford the diesel. So that makes me crazy, and I feel for guys that still hunt public land, because it's gotten tougher.
Well, like I said, I hunt it 95% in a lot of different states. I mean, we may hunt 6 states in a year, and I'll say, I think there's way more. Just giving you a public land hunter's perspective, I think there's way more talk about pressure than it actually is.
Yeah.
If you put in the work, you're going to have success. And I know time has a factor in that. We get to hunt a lot, but I know a lot of guys who only get to go out there on Saturday that put in the work and they're successful. It's just, I think there's still a lot of good opportunity out there is what I'm saying. And I hope that sentiment that it's too much pressure, don't hunt public, don't affect a lot of these younger guys.
Oh yeah. No, I agree with you. In Louisiana, I was in a lease for a couple of years and frankly didn't like hunting the exact same spot. And I started hunting public land and I loved it. And
sure,
my only limitation was that I could only go, occasionally, but boy, it was fabulous hunting down on the Atchafalaya, and I just loved it. So yeah,
sure. Well, I've held you here for a long time, longer than you probably need to stay, but I want you to, if you don't mind, would you end by kind of just giving what your thoughts are on the future of the duck population, and then just the future on duck hunting in general? What do you see coming for the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's really hard to predict 5 to 10 years, just because so much, ducks are driven by what happens on the prairies, and it just depends on whether we get water and then whether good things happen. We had a tough winter last year, and the predators took a beating on our trap sites that we've consistently trapped. We got lots fewer. So for this fall, even though the duck numbers are down, I think it's going to be a better year than last year, just because I think production was much better. And certainly in the Dakotas and several other places look pretty good. So, and frankly, we live on duck production. It's not the returning adults that make a huge difference, particularly down south. So I think it's going to be better than last year. It's not going to be an epic year. We just have too few ponds, and when mallard numbers are 23% below the long-term average, you just can't have them coming out of the woodwork all of a sudden. But
sure.
I think it's going to be pretty good. I sure hope we hit another few years where we have crazy water everywhere, and particularly the prairies of Saskatchewan. That Saskatchewan, let's face it, it's got more wetlands than any other jurisdiction. Manitoba's got 20% of Canada wetlands. Saskatchewan's got 60. Alberta's got another 20% of the Canadian wetlands. So we need a lot of water in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Sure.
I'd love to see it. I can't look into a crystal ball and say whether it's going to be wet next year.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I guess what I really meant is, what do you think? What do you see the future as duck hunting as a sport? Where do you think it's going to be? Do you think, we're sitting as good as we can hope, or do you not feel good about the trend that we're on?
I worry about the loss of hunters, and we're losing hunters that, the weekend guys that can only go 2 weekends, they're bailing out when it's tough for them to find a spot, or the ducks just aren't there. I really worry about that because, I'm not, and I hear a lot of folks worry about it from the funding part. Personally, that's not my worry. My worry is about the future of the sport. And if we get down to a couple 100,000, man, are we easy to vote out of existence. And
sure.
So that's my real scare. I want to see this enterprise continue for 150 years. And there's plenty of potential. We got a lot of protected habitat. We need to protect more in Canada, that's for sure. But that's what worries me a lot, is the loss of hunters. I think ducks are pretty resilient, and when we get a bunch of wet years, they're going to come back. I really like Delta's notion that we got a lot of great habitat that's really not producing up to potential. And so this million duck campaign, people have often said, well, you can't trap the whole prairies. Well, we're not talking about it. We're talking about trapping 1.5% of the prairie pothole region to produce 1 million ducks. So you go to the best of the best and trap, and you really produce a lot of ducks. So we've got the ability to produce ducks, and I think the ducks are going to be okay. I'm worried about the hunters in the long term. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you, I sure appreciate you taking the time just to shed some light on all these issues. I know there's every year when the duck populations come out, there's so much talk about it. So I hope that this is kind of helps people get a better understanding of it. And it's just, I've learned a lot.
I'm 69. I have no intention of quitting. You know, I got this great job working on ducks, and I love talking ducks. So it's been a great hour for me as well.
Yeah. Well, I know I appreciate everything you're doing for the duck population and just duck hunting as a sport as a whole. So I sure appreciate you having you here, and thanks for everybody who watched.
Yep. Enjoyed it. Thanks, Jake.